Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into ancient Greece, circa 776 BCE, where athletic competition meant death was literally on the table, nudity was mandatory, and your biggest concern wasn't winning a medal, but surviving long enough to see the closing ceremonies. So, before we explore why you'd be absolutely spectacularly dead within hours of arriving at the first Olympics, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy watching me explain historical ways to die horribly. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Because unlike our ancient Greek friends, we actually have reliable ways to tell time that don't involve staring at the sun and hoping for the best. Now, settle in with whatever modern comfort you prefer: air conditioning, clean water, medical insurance, and let's journey back to a time when athletic competition was essentially ritualized warfare, where cheating got you publicly flogged, and where the phrase, "May the best man win," was less inspirational motto and more survival prayer. We're about to discover why the ancient Olympics make modern extreme sports look like a gentle yoga class, and why your carefully curated Instagram fitness routine would be about as useful as a chocolate chariot in the Mediterranean sun. Tonight's tale is a masterclass in historical humility, a reminder that our ancestors weren't just tougher than us, they were operating in a completely different universe of pain tolerance, religious fervor, and casual acceptance of death as a spectator sport. So dim whatever electric lights you have. Appreciate that you can do so with the flip of a switch, rather than hoping your olive oil lamp doesn't burn down your entire city. And let's ease into this journey to a world where Olympic glory came with a very real chance of Olympic obituary. You arrive in Olympia, Greece, in 776 BCE, and immediately realize that your biggest mistake wasn't time traveling to ancient Greece. It was assuming you understood what the word athletic meant before witnessing a completely naked Greek man throw a bronze discus with enough force to decapitate a small horse while screaming for thing that roughly translates to "for the honor of Polis, and also my extremely well-oiled buttocks." The first thing you notice about the ancient Olympics isn't the inspiration of competition. It's the smell. Imagine if a gymnasium, a barn, and a wine cellar had a baby, then left that baby unwashed in the Mediterranean sun for 4 days straight. That's Olympia during the games. Thousands of Greek men, all completely nude, all sweating profusely, all consuming nothing but bread, cheese, wine, and what appears to be the occasional sacrificial goat. The aromatic experience alone would probably kill you before you even made it to the stadium. But let's say you survived the olfactory assault. The next challenge is understanding that these aren't really games in any sense you'd recognize. These are religious festivals where athletic competition serves as entertainment for the gods, specifically Zeus, who apparently enjoys watching mortals run around naked while throwing heavy objects at each other. The ancient Greeks took this seriously. Violating the sacred truce that protected travelers coming to Olympia was punishable by death. Cheating during the games was punishable by massive fines and public humiliation that could bankrupt entire city-states. And competing while not being Greek, well, that was punishable by being thrown off a cliff, which was less of a punishment and more of a very brief flying lesson with a guaranteed bad landing. You quickly realize that your modern understanding of athletic competition is adorably quaint compared to what's happening around you. The ancient Greek concept of athletics wasn't about personal bests or participation trophies. It was about achieving physical perfection in service to the gods while simultaneously proving your state's superiority over everyone else's state. These men didn't train for 4 years. They trained their entire lives, often starting as children, with the understanding that athletic excellence was the closest a mortal could come to divine favor. Losing wasn't disappointing. It was essentially a public admission that the gods found you insufficient. The stadium itself is a marvel of ancient engineering, which is a polite way of saying it's a large dirt field surrounded by grassy hills where spectators sit directly on the ground. There are no seats, no shade, no bathrooms, and definitely no concession stands selling overpriced hot dogs. The spectators bring their own food, their own wine, and their own slaves to fan them when the heat becomes unbearable. The wealthy ones arrive with entire households, setting up temporary camps that look like small cities. The poor ones bring bread and hope they don't die of heat stroke while watching someone else achieve glory. You attempt to register as a competitor, which immediately reveals your first major problem: you're not Greek. The Olympics were exclusively for free-born Greek men. Women weren't allowed to compete. They weren't even allowed to watch, on pain of death. The only exception was the priestess of Demeter, who got a special seat and presumably spent the entire time praying that none of these naked men would do anything that required divine intervention. Being foreign, female, or enslaved meant you were automatically disqualified from participating in anything except possibly being sacrificed to ensure the gods' favor. But let's imagine, for the sake of argument, that you somehow convince the judges you're a legitimate Greek citizen. Perhaps you've learned enough ancient Greek to fake your way through the registration process. Maybe you've acquired the proper documentation through means that definitely weren't available in 776 BCE. The next challenge is the oath ceremony, where all competitors swear by Zeus that they've been training for at least 10 months and haven't committed any crimes that would make them unworthy of divine attention. This oath is taken while standing next to a statue of Zeus holding a thunderbolt, just in case anyone was unclear about the consequences of perjury. The training facilities in Olympia are simultaneously impressive and terrifying. The gymnasium is a large rectangular building with a roofed colonnade surrounding an open courtyard. This is where athletes practice when the weather is bad, which in Mediterranean Greece means basically never. The palaestra is a smaller building designed specifically for wrestling and boxing practice, with sand floors that are raked daily and sprinkled with oil. This sounds pleasant until you realize that the oil isn't for relaxation. It's to make the wrestlers harder to grip, which means every match is essentially a contest to see who can maintain their hold on what is essentially a greased human torpedo. Your first real introduction to ancient Olympic athletics comes during the practice sessions, where you quickly discover that every single event is designed to either kill you outright or inflict injuries that would require modern surgery to repair properly. The stadium, the shortest foot race, is a 200-yard sprint run completely naked on a dirt track. This doesn't sound particularly lethal until you remember that ancient Greek sprinters didn't wear shoes. They ran barefoot on packed earth mixed with sand and small rocks at speeds that would impress modern track coaches, while maintaining perfect form because stumbling during a race was considered both shameful and dangerous. Falling during the stadium wasn't just embarrassing. It could easily result in being trampled by the other runners, who wouldn't stop to help because stopping during a race was considered unsportsmanlike and possibly blasphemous. The Dialos, a 400-yard race that required runners to sprint to one end of the stadium and back, introduced the additional challenge of making a sharp turn at full speed on loose dirt, while surrounded by other naked men doing exactly the same thing. The turn itself was around a post called a nyssa, and the technique for navigating it safely was apparently hope for the best and try not to crash into anyone else. Collision injuries during the Dialos were so common that spectators would bet on which runner would finish with the most blood on them, not just which one would finish first. The Dolikos, the longest-running event, was essentially an ancient marathon that covered anywhere from 12 to 24 laps of the stadium, depending on who was organizing the race and how sadistic they were feeling. Ancient Greek distance runners didn't pace themselves the way modern marathoners do. They sprinted the entire distance, fueled by nothing but wine, olive oil, and what can only be described as religious fervor. Dehydration during the Dolikos wasn't uncommon. It was expected. Runners would collapse regularly, and the ones who didn't were considered either divinely blessed or possibly not human. But the running events, dangerous as they were nothing compared to the combat sports. Ancient Greek boxing makes modern boxing look like a friendly disagreement between accountants. Boxers didn't wear gloves. They wore leather straps called hymantes that wrapped around their hands and wrists, designed not to protect their hands, but to inflict maximum damage on their opponents. These straps were often embedded with metal studs or sharp pieces of leather that could cut skin and break bones. Boxing matches didn't have rounds, time limits, or weight classes. They continued until one participant was either unconscious, dead, or raised his hand to signal defeat. Raising your hand to signal defeat was considered honorable. But it was also an admission that you weren't tough enough to keep fighting until you died, which made it a somewhat complicated decision. The pancration was even worse. It combined boxing and wrestling with virtually no rules, except that eye gouging and biting were discouraged, but not technically illegal. Pancration matches were fights to the death or submission, whichever came first. Competitors would use chokes, joint locks, strikes, throws, and occasionally improvised weapons like rocks or sticks they found lying around the arena. The pancration was considered the ultimate test of athletic ability because it required strength, speed, endurance, flexibility, and the kind of creative problem-solving skills that come in handy when someone is trying to strangle you with their bare hands. Wrestling was slightly more civilized, in that the objective was to throw your opponent to the ground 3 times rather than to kill them outright. However, ancient Greek wrestling matches took place on sand that had been mixed with oil, which made the footing treacherous and the competitors extremely difficult to grip. Wrestlers would cover themselves with additional oil and then dust themselves with sand to provide some texture, which created a gritty paste that got into every possible crevice of the human body. Wrestling matches could last for hours, with both participants becoming increasingly exhausted, dehydrated, and covered in what was essentially ancient sandpaper. The pentathlon combined running, jumping, discus throwing, javelin throwing, and wrestling into a single competition that tested every aspect of athletic ability while simultaneously maximizing the chances of serious injury. Pentathletes were considered the most complete athletes because they had to excel at 5 different disciplines, any one of which could cripple or kill them. The long jump was performed while carrying stone or metal weights called halters, which were supposed to help with momentum, but frequently resulted in competitors losing their balance and landing awkwardly on the sand pit. The landing area wasn't padded. It was just sand, packed hard enough to prevent long-term deformation but soft enough to leave impressive craters when someone landed badly. Discus throwing involved hurling a bronze disc that weighed between 2 and 15 pounds, depending on the age and strength of the competitor. The discus was thrown from a small circle, and competitors were expected to achieve both distance and accuracy while maintaining perfect form. The challenge wasn't just throwing the discus as far as possible. It was throwing it far enough to impress the judges, while making sure it didn't land on any spectators, officials, or other competitors. Discus accidents were common enough that spectators learned to pay attention to the throwing events, not just for the sport but for their own safety. Javelin throwing was even more dangerous because the javelin was essentially a spear designed to penetrate armor and kill people. Olympic javelins were lighter than military spears, but still perfectly capable of causing fatal injuries if thrown incorrectly, or if someone wandered into the wrong area at the wrong time. Javelin throwers aimed for both distance and accuracy, often competing to see who could hit specific targets rather than just throwing as far as possible. The targets were usually shields or posts set up at the far end of the field, but occasionally they were live animals, which added an element of excitement for the spectators and terror for anyone responsible for retrieving the javelins afterward. The chariot races were held in the hippodrome, a separate facility designed specifically for equestrian events. Chariot racing was the most expensive Olympic sport because it required horses, chariots, drivers, and support staff, which meant only the wealthy could afford to participate. However, it was also the most democratic in terms of participation, because the victor was technically the owner of the horses, not the driver. This meant that wealthy women could win Olympic victories by proxy, even though they couldn't attend the games to watch their own horses compete. The chariot races themselves were spectacular displays of speed, skill, and catastrophic accidents. The hippodrome was an oval track approximately 400 yards long, with sharp turns at each end marked by posts called matai. Chariot races typically involved 12 laps, which meant 24 turns at high speed on a dirt track with multiple chariots competing simultaneously. The chariots were lightweight vehicles designed for speed, rather than safety, with minimal protection for the driver and no safety equipment whatsoever. Crashes were not just common but expected, and spectators would often bet on which lap would produce the most spectacular wreckage. Chariot drivers, called hiniochi, were usually slaves or hired professionals rather than the horse owners themselves. This was partly because chariot racing was considered too dangerous for wealthy citizens, and partly because driving a chariot required specialized skills that took years to develop. The drivers wore minimal protective gear, usually just a tunic and a helmet, and relied entirely on their ability to control the horses and navigate the course without colliding with other chariots or the track barriers. The four-horse chariot race, called the Tethripon, was the most prestigious and dangerous event. 4 horses pulling a single chariot at full speed around a relatively narrow track created opportunities for spectacular crashes that could eliminate multiple teams simultaneously. The horses were often spooked by the noise from the crowd, the dust kicked up by other chariots, or the sight of crashed vehicles and injured drivers. A spooked horse could easily drag a chariot off course or into other competitors, creating chain reaction crashes that left the track littered with broken chariots, injured horses, and unconscious drivers. The 2-horse chariot race, called the Sonoris, was slightly safer, but still extremely dangerous. The lighter chariots could achieve higher speeds, but were also less stable, especially during turns. Drivers had to balance speed with control, pushing their horses as fast as possible while maintaining enough control to navigate the turns without flipping the chariot or colliding with the track barriers. Horse racing, where riders competed without chariots, was considered less prestigious than chariot racing, but was still dangerous enough to produce regular casualties. Ancient Greek jockeys rode bareback without stirrups, saddles, or any other modern safety equipment. They controlled their horses using only reins and their own balance, while racing at speeds that would terrify modern jockeys. Falls during horse races were usually less fatal than chariot crashes, but only because a single falling horse created less chaos than a team of panicked horses dragging a broken chariot. The religious aspects of the Olympics were as important as the athletic competition, and they added their own dangers for anyone unfamiliar with ancient Greek religious practices. The games began with elaborate sacrificial ceremonies designed to secure the favor of Zeus and the other Olympian gods. These ceremonies involved killing hundreds of animals, usually cattle, sheep, and pigs, in front of crowds of thousands of people. The sacrificial altar was a massive stone structure where animals were slaughtered by priests using bronze knives, and the blood was collected in special vessels and poured over the altar as an offering to the gods. Participating in these ceremonies required specific knowledge of proper religious procedures, and making a mistake during a sacrifice was considered not just embarrassing, but potentially blasphemous. Foreign visitors who didn't understand Greek religious customs could easily commit accidental sacrilege, which could result in being banned from the games, or, in extreme cases, being attacked by religious zealots who believed the gods required immediate punishment for any disrespect. The athletic events themselves were also considered religious ceremonies, with each victory dedicated to the gods and each defeat interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure. Winners were crowned with olive wreaths cut from a sacred olive tree near the temple of Zeus, and the crowning ceremony involved prayers and offerings that had to be performed exactly according to tradition. The olive wreaths weren't just symbolic prizes. They were believed to carry divine blessing, and wearing one incorrectly or without proper reverence was considered a serious religious offense. The social aspects of the Olympics created additional challenges for anyone not familiar with ancient Greek customs and social hierarchies. The games were attended by representatives from every major Greek city, state, and the interactions between different groups were governed by complex political and social protocols. Insulting someone from a more powerful city, state could result in diplomatic incidents that might escalate into military conflicts. Supporting the wrong athlete or celebrating inappropriately could mark you as a political enemy or social outcast. The spectators themselves were a dangerous element. Ancient Greek sports fans were passionate to the point of violence, and riots during the games were not uncommon. Different states would send organized groups of supporters who would cheer for their own athletes and attempt to intimidate or distract competitors from rival cities. These groups would often engage in fights with each other, using fists, sticks, stones, and occasionally actual weapons. Olympic officials had limited ability to control crowd violence, and spectators who got caught up in riots could easily be injured or killed in the chaos. The heat in Olympia during the Summer Games was brutal. Daytime temperatures regularly reached over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and there was virtually no shade in the stadium or hippodrome. Spectators would arrive before dawn to claim the best spots and would spend the entire day sitting in direct sunlight, drinking wine and eating food that spoiled quickly in the heat. Heat exhaustion and dehydration were common among both competitors and spectators, and medical care was limited to basic first aid and prayers to Asclepius, the god of healing. The medical knowledge available in 776 BCE was primitive by modern standards, which meant that injuries that would be easily treatable today could be fatal in ancient Greece. Broken bones were set using wooden splints and linen bandages, with no anesthesia or antibiotics to prevent infection. Cuts and abrasions were cleaned with wine and bandaged with cloth, but deep wounds frequently became infected and could lead to blood poisoning or gangrene. Head injuries were particularly dangerous because ancient physicians had no way to diagnose or treat internal bleeding or brain damage. The food available during the games was another potential source of problems. Ancient food preservation methods were unreliable, and the combination of summer heat and thousands of people created ideal conditions for foodborne illnesses. Meat was often preserved using salt or smoking, but these methods didn't eliminate all bacteria, and food poisoning was common. The water supply in Olympia was adequate for the local population, but was strained by the influx of visitors during the games, and contaminated water could spread diseases like dysentery or cholera. The sleeping accommodations for most visitors were basic at best. Wealthy spectators brought their own tents and servants, but most people slept on the ground under the stars or in makeshift shelters constructed from cloth and branches. These temporary camps had no sanitation facilities, no protection from rain or wind, and no security against theft or violence. Sleeping outdoors in ancient Greece meant sharing space with insects, snakes, wild animals, and fellow humans who might not have honorable intentions. The monetary system in ancient Greece was complex and varied between different city-states, which created opportunities for confusion and fraud. Merchants and vendors would accept coins from some cities, but not others, and exchange rates fluctuated based on political relationships and the perceived stability of different governments. Visitors who didn't understand the local currency could easily be cheated, and carrying large amounts of valuable coins made them targets for robbery. The legal system in Olympia was based on religious law rather than civil law, which meant that disputes were resolved by priests and religious officials rather than judges trained in legal procedure. The punishments for various offences were based on religious tradition and divine commandments, rather than proportional justice or rehabilitation. Stealing during the games was considered not just a crime against the victim, but a sin against the gods, and the punishments were correspondingly severe. Language barriers created additional challenges for anyone not fluent in ancient Greek. While many educated Greeks spoke multiple languages, the common people in Olympia spoke only local dialects that could be difficult to understand even for Greeks from other regions. Miscommunication could lead to misunderstandings that might escalate into conflicts, and anyone who couldn't communicate effectively was at a severe disadvantage in negotiating for food, shelter, or safe passage. The political situation in ancient Greece was constantly volatile, with different states forming and breaking alliances based on changing circumstances. The Olympic truce was supposed to protect travelers from military action, but it didn't prevent political disputes or personal vendettas from spilling over into violence. Visitors from cities that were currently at war with each other might find themselves in dangerous situations if they encountered enemies away from the protection of Olympic officials. The roads leading to Olympia were dangerous even during times of peace. Bandits operated regularly on the major roads, targeting travelers who were known to be carrying valuables for the games. The mountainous terrain provided excellent hiding spots for ambushes, and there were no police forces or military patrols to protect civilian travelers. Merchants and spectators would often travel in large groups for protection, but even organized caravans could be attacked by well-armed bandits. The ships that transported visitors to Greece from other parts of the Mediterranean were primitive by modern standards and subject to the whims of weather and navigation errors. Ancient sailors relied on landmarks and star positions for navigation, and storms could easily blow ships off course or sink them entirely. Pirates operated in most areas of the Mediterranean, and merchant ships were frequent targets because they were known to carry valuable cargo and wealthy passengers. Even if you somehow managed to survive the journey to Olympia, register as a competitor, and avoid being killed during the preliminary events, the actual competition would present its own unique challenges. Ancient Greek athletes competed not just against each other, but against the expectations of their families, their city-states, and the gods themselves. The pressure to perform was enormous, and the consequences of failure were severe. A poor performance in the Olympics could ruin an athlete's reputation permanently and bring shame to their entire family and city. Athletes who were expected to win, but didn't, were sometimes exiled from their home cities or forced to pay enormous fines to compensate for the embarrassment they had caused. The financial investments that wealthy patrons made in training and equipping athletes meant that failure could result in bankruptcy or debt slavery for the athlete and their family. The judging system was based on the observations of appointed officials, called Hellenodikai, who were responsible for enforcing the rules and determining winners in events where the outcome wasn't immediately obvious. These judges were human beings with their own biases, political affiliations, and susceptibility to bribery. Controversial decisions were common, and athletes who believed they had been cheated had no appeals process except to petition the gods directly, which was not typically an effective legal strategy. The training regimen required to compete successfully in the ancient Olympics was far more extreme than anything a modern person would be prepared for. Ancient Greek athletes followed a system called tetras, which involved 4-day training cycles with different focuses for each day. The training was supervised by coaches called paidotribes, who were known for their harsh methods and willingness to use physical punishment to motivate their athletes. The diet required for Olympic training was based on large quantities of meat, particularly beef and pork, supplemented with cheese, wine, and honey cakes. This diet was designed to build muscle mass and strength, but it was extremely expensive and nutritionally unbalanced by modern standards. Athletes who couldn't afford the proper diet were at a severe disadvantage, and malnutrition was a common problem among competitors from poorer backgrounds. The social isolation required for serious training meant that Olympic athletes often had difficulty maintaining normal relationships or developing practical life skills outside of their sport. Athletes who dedicated their lives to training for the Olympics frequently found themselves unemployable if they didn't achieve success, and the ancient Greek economy didn't provide many opportunities for retired athletes. The equipment used in ancient Olympic events was handmade and varied significantly in quality and safety. Wealthy athletes could afford the best bronze discuses, javelins made from the finest wood, and chariots built by master craftsmen. Poor athletes had to use whatever equipment they could afford or borrow, which might be poorly balanced, structurally unsound, or simply inappropriate for their size and strength. The psychological pressure of competing in the Olympics was intensified by the religious significance of the Games, and the belief that athletic performance was directly connected to divine favor. Athletes who were struggling with their events couldn't simply blame bad training or poor preparation. They had to consider the possibility that the gods were displeased with them personally, which added spiritual anxiety to the normal competitive stress. The aftermath of the Olympics was almost as dangerous as the Games themselves. Successful athletes would return to their home cities as heroes, but they would also be targets for kidnapping, robbery, or political manipulation. Wealthy city-states would attempt to recruit successful athletes by offering them citizenship, money, or political positions, which could create diplomatic tensions and personal conflicts. Unsuccessful athletes faced different, but equally serious problems. Returning home after a poor Olympic performance meant facing the disappointment of family members, friends, and fellow citizens who had invested their hopes and money in the athlete's success. Some athletes who failed to meet expectations would choose to become exiles rather than face the shame of returning home as losers. The economic impact of the Olympics on individual competitors was severe regardless of their performance. The cost of training, equipment, travel, and accommodation for the Games could bankrupt entire families, and there were no prize money or sponsorship opportunities to offset these expenses. Athletes competed for the honor of victory and the favor of the gods, not for financial gain, which meant that even successful competitors might return home poorer than when they left. The long-term physical consequences of competing in ancient Olympic events were severe and unavoidable. Athletes who survived their competitive careers typically suffered from chronic pain, permanent injuries, and reduced life expectancy due to the accumulated damage from years of extreme training and competition. The medical knowledge available at the time was insufficient to treat most sports injuries properly, and many former athletes live with disabilities would be easily correctable today. The political implications of Olympic competition extended far beyond individual glory or shame. Athletic victories were interpreted as signs of divine favor for entire city-states, and defeats could be seen as evidence of political or moral weakness. Wars were sometimes started over perceived insults related to Olympic performances, and diplomatic relationships between cities could be permanently damaged by controversial outcomes in athletic events. Your modern sensibilities would be constantly offended by the casual violence, religious extremism, and social inequalities that were fundamental aspects of ancient Greek culture. The acceptance of slavery, the exclusion of women from public life, and the glorification of warfare as a normal part of human existence were not controversial opinions in 776 BCE. They were basic assumptions that shaped every aspect of society, including the Olympic Games. The language barrier would be more severe than you might expect. Ancient Greek was significantly different from modern Greek, and even if you were fluent in the modern language, you would struggle to understand the archaic dialects and religious terminology used in Olympic ceremonies. Miscommunication about rules, procedures, or religious requirements could easily result in disqualification or worse. The legal protections that modern people take for granted simply didn't exist in ancient Greece. There were no human rights, no due process protections, and no appeals courts to correct judicial errors. Justice was administered by whoever had the most political power, and foreigners had virtually no legal standing in disputes with Greek citizens. Being accused of any crime, regardless of guilt or innocence, could result in immediate punishment without trial or investigation. The concept of consent, particularly regarding women but also regarding slaves and lower-class citizens, was fundamentally different in ancient Greek society. Many practices that would be considered criminal today were perfectly legal and socially acceptable in 776 BCE. The social hierarchy was enforced through violence and intimidation, and challenging the existing power structure was considered both dangerous and impious. The educational background required to function effectively in ancient Greek society was completely different from modern education. Ancient Greeks valued rhetoric, philosophy, military strategy, and religious knowledge over practical skills or scientific literacy. Your modern education would be largely irrelevant to the challenges you would face, and your lack of classical training would mark you as uneducated regardless of your actual intelligence or abilities. The technological limitations of ancient Greek society would be more frustrating and dangerous than you might anticipate. There were no maps, no weather forecasts, no emergency medical services, and no communication systems that could function over long distances. Getting lost, injured, or sick far from home could easily be fatal because there was no way to call for help or navigate back to safety. The religious obligations that governed every aspect of ancient Greek life would be impossible for a modern person to fulfill correctly. The number of gods, goddesses, spirits, and religious ceremonies that required proper observance was overwhelming, and the penalties for religious errors were severe. Ancient Greeks spent a significant portion of their time and money on religious obligations, and anyone who didn't participate fully was considered suspicious and potentially dangerous. In the end, your chances of surviving the first Olympic Games would be essentially zero. The combination of physical dangers, cultural barriers, legal vulnerabilities, and technological limitations would create an almost insurmountable series of challenges. Even if you managed to avoid being killed in the athletic events themselves, the probability of dying from disease, accident, violence, or simple misunderstanding would be extremely high. The ancient Olympics were not a celebration of human achievement in the modern sense. They were a religious festival designed to honor the gods through displays of physical excellence, and human safety was a secondary consideration at best. The games were created by and for a society that valued honor, glory, and divine favor over individual survival or comfort, and anyone who didn't share those values would find themselves at a severe disadvantage. Your best strategy for surviving the first Olympics would be to avoid attending them entirely. Stay home, read about them in history books, and be grateful that modern athletic competition includes safety regulations, medical support, and legal protections that would have been incomprehensible to the ancient Greeks. The Olympics have evolved significantly over the past 800 years, and almost all of those changes have been improvements from the perspective of participant safety and basic human rights. But if you absolutely had to attend the ancient Olympics, your survival would depend on careful preparation, extensive cultural research, and an enormous amount of luck. You would need to learn ancient Greek fluently, study Greek religious practices in detail, understand the political relationships between different states, and develop the physical fitness required to avoid being completely humiliated in whatever events you chose to enter. Even with perfect preparation, your chances of surviving would still be poor, because the ancient world was simply more dangerous than anything a modern person is equipped to handle. The romantic notion of competing in the original Olympics is appealing until you consider the reality of what that would actually involve. Ancient athletes were not amateurs competing for the love of sport. They were semi-professional warriors who had trained their entire lives for the opportunity to achieve glory through violence and physical dominance. The games themselves were not friendly competitions, but deadly serious contests where failure could result in permanent injury, social disgrace, or actual death. The spectacle of the ancient Olympics would be unlike anything in modern sports. The combination of religious ceremony, political theatre, and life, or death athletic competition created an atmosphere of intensity that would be overwhelming for anyone accustomed to contemporary sporting events. The crowd noise alone would be deafening, as thousands of Greeks shouted encouragement to their favourites while simultaneously cursing their enemies and invoking divine intervention on behalf of their chosen athletes. Your modern assumptions about fair play, sportsmanship, and athlete safety would be not just irrelevant, but actively counterproductive in ancient Olympic competition. The goal was not to compete fairly, but to win by any means necessary while maintaining enough honor to satisfy the gods. Cheating was forbidden, but the definition of cheating was much narrower than modern standards, and many tactics that would be considered unsportsmanlike today were perfectly acceptable in ancient Greece. The aftermath of competing in the ancient Olympics would follow you for the rest of your life, regardless of how well or poorly you performed. Ancient Greek society had long memories for both triumph and failure, and your Olympic performance would become part of your permanent identity in ways that modern people would find oppressive. Successful athletes were expected to maintain their physical condition and continue competing until age or injury forced them to retire, while unsuccessful athletes were expected to accept their defeat gracefully and avoid embarrassing themselves or their families further. The financial implications of Olympic competition would be devastating for anyone without substantial independent wealth. The cost of training, equipment, travel, and accommodation would consume years of income for most ancient Greeks, and there was no guarantee of any return on investment. Even successful athletes received only symbolic prizes, and the economic benefits of victory were indirect and unpredictable. Your modern understanding of nutrition, exercise physiology, and sports psychology would be largely useless in the context of ancient Olympic training. Ancient Greek athletic preparation was based on tradition, religious belief, and trial and error rather than scientific research, and athletes who tried to innovate or modernize their training methods would be viewed with suspicion by coaches, officials, and fellow competitors. The social expectations surrounding Olympic competition would be impossible for a modern person to fulfill authentically. Ancient Greek athletes were expected to embody ideals of masculine perfection, religious devotion, and civic virtue that were specific to their culture and time period. Your inability to meet these expectations would be immediately obvious to everyone around you and would mark you as an outsider regardless of your athletic ability. The political dimensions of the ancient Olympics would be dangerous for anyone without detailed knowledge of the complex relationships between Greek city-states. Supporting the wrong athlete, celebrating inappropriately, or making innocent comments that could be interpreted as political statements could result in diplomatic incidents or personal vendettas that might follow you home after the Games ended. In conclusion, the first Olympic Games were a product of their time and culture, designed by and for people whose lives, values, and expectations were fundamentally different from those of modern humans. The romantic appeal of competing in the original Olympics dissolves quickly when confronted with the reality of what that would actually require. Your chances of surviving the experience would be minimal, and even if you managed to avoid death or serious injury, you would almost certainly return home traumatized, impoverished, and fundamentally changed by exposure to a world that was simultaneously more brutal and more glorious than anything in contemporary experience. The ancient Olympics were not the beginning of a tradition that leads directly to modern athletic competition. They were a unique cultural phenomenon that reflected the specific beliefs, practices, and priorities of ancient Greek civilization. Understanding them requires abandoning modern assumptions about sports, competition, and human rights, and accepting that the past was not simply a less advanced version of the present, but a completely different world with its own internal logic and moral framework. The lesson of the ancient Olympics is not that modern sports have lost their original purity or spiritual significance. It is that human cultures create institutions that serve their own needs and values, and those institutions evolve or disappear as cultures change. The Olympics survived and thrived because they were able to adapt to different societies and historical periods, not because they preserved some eternal ideal of athletic competition. Your inability to survive the first Olympics would not be a personal failure, but a natural consequence of being displaced in time and culture. Ancient Greeks would be equally unlikely to survive in the modern world, not because they were inferior people, but because they were adapted to different circumstances and challenges. The gap between ancient and modern life is not just technological but fundamental, involving basic assumptions about the nature of human existence, social organization, and the proper relationship between individuals and their communities. The fantasy of competing in the ancient Olympics is appealing because it represents a simpler, more heroic world where individual achievement could bring immortal glory and divine favor. The reality is that this world was also more dangerous, more arbitrary, and more constrained by social hierarchies and religious obligations than modern people would find tolerable. The trade-offs involved in ancient Greek life were real and significant, and the benefits they received in exchange for their sacrifices were meaningful only within the context of their own cultural values. Understanding the ancient Olympics requires historical empathy rather than romantic nostalgia. It means trying to see the world through the eyes of people whose experiences and assumptions were radically different from our own, while acknowledging that we can never fully bridge the gap between past and present. The ancient Greeks created something remarkable within the constraints of their own time and place, and we can appreciate their achievement without wanting to recreate their world or live according to their rules. The ultimate irony of the ancient Olympics is that they were both more and less than modern people imagine them to be. They were more significant religiously, politically, and culturally than contemporary sporting events, but they were also more limited in scope, more exclusive in participation, and more dangerous for everyone involved. They represented the best and worst of ancient Greek civilization, combining remarkable artistic and athletic achievement with casual acceptance of violence, inequality, and human suffering. Your inability to survive the first Olympics is not a criticism of your character or abilities, but a recognition of the historical distance between ancient and modern life. The world has changed in ways that make ancient practices impossible and ancient assumptions irrelevant, but it has also created new possibilities and opportunities that the ancient Greeks could never have imagined. The evolution of the Olympic Games from their ancient origins to their modern form reflects broader changes in human society that have generally made life safer, more equitable, and more comfortable for ordinary people. The ancient Olympics were extraordinary for their time and place, but that time and place are gone forever. Modern people can study them, admire them, and learn from them, but we cannot and should not try to recreate them. The challenge for contemporary society is not to recapture the supposed glory of the ancient world, but to create new forms of excellence and achievement that serve current needs and reflect current values, while honoring the genuine accomplishments of our predecessors. In the end, the ancient Olympics were a magnificent anachronism, even when they were new, representing ideals and practices that were already beginning to change as Greek society evolved. They survived as long as they did because they served important social, political, and religious functions, but their eventual decline was inevitable as the world that created them disappeared. The most sobering aspect of imagining yourself at the first Olympics is realizing how completely unprepared modern life leaves us for the realities of the ancient world. We are accustomed to safety regulations, emergency services, legal protections, and technological conveniences that would have been incomprehensible luxuries to ancient peoples. Our physical conditioning is adequate for modern sedentary life, but laughably insufficient for a world where survival required constant physical exertion and the ability to endure pain, hunger, and exhaustion without complaint. Even our mental and emotional conditioning is wrong for ancient life. We expect fairness, predictability, and rational explanations for events that affect us. Ancient Greeks expected the intervention of capricious gods, the dominance of the strong over the weak, and the acceptance of suffering as a normal part of human existence. Our psychological frameworks for understanding success, failure, justice, and meaning would not just be unhelpful in ancient Greece, but actively counterproductive. The clothing alone would probably kill you before you ever reached the stadium. Ancient Greek garments were designed for their climate and lifestyle, but they provided minimal protection against injury and no accommodation for the kind of physical activity that Olympic competition required. The idea of specialized athletic equipment, protective gear, or even basic first aid supplies would have been foreign concepts. Athletes competed with whatever natural advantages they possessed, and whatever equipment they could afford or borrow, accepting that injury and death were natural consequences of pushing human performance to its limits. The water situation at Olympia during the Games would be particularly dangerous for anyone accustomed to modern sanitation standards. Thousands of people gathering in a relatively small area for several days would quickly overwhelm the local water supply and waste disposal systems. The risk of waterborne diseases would be enormous, and the medical knowledge available to treat such illnesses would be primitive at best. Dysentery, cholera, and other digestive ailments were common during large gatherings, and they could be fatal for people whose immune systems weren't adapted to ancient pathogens. The insects and vermin that would flourish in the temporary camps surrounding Olympia would carry their own diseases and discomforts. There were no effective insect repellents, no screens to keep flies and mosquitoes away from food and sleeping areas, and no understanding of the connection between insect bites and disease transmission. Malaria, which was endemic in many parts of ancient Greece, was spread by mosquitoes that flourished in the marshy areas around Olympia during the summer months. The noise levels during the Games would be overwhelming by modern standards. Thousands of spectators cheering, shouting, and arguing without any electronic amplification or crowd control would create a constant din that would make communication difficult and sleep nearly impossible. The acoustic design of the stadium and hippodrome was intended to carry sound rather than contain it, which meant that the noise from the events would travel for miles in all directions. The dust generated by athletic events and the movement of large crowds would be another health hazard. The sandy soil of Olympia would be kicked up constantly by runners, wrestlers, horses, and spectators, creating clouds of fine particles that would irritate eyes, noses, and lungs. There were no masks or filters to protect against dust inhalation, and the combination of dust, sweat, and heat would create breathing difficulties for anyone with respiratory sensitivities. The fire hazards in the temporary camps would be severe. Thousands of people cooking meals, lighting torches, and maintaining fires for warmth and light in close proximity would create numerous opportunities for accidental blazes. The tents, shelters, and temporary structures were made from flammable materials, and there were no fire departments or emergency services to respond to blazes. A fire that started in one area could quickly spread through entire sections of the camp, trapping people who were sleeping or unable to move quickly. The theft and banditry that accompanied large gatherings would be another constant threat. The combination of wealthy visitors carrying valuables and temporary living arrangements with minimal security would attract criminals from throughout the region. Pickpockets, robbers, and con artists would work the crowds, and there would be no police force adequate to maintain order or investigate crimes. Victims of theft would have little recourse, except to seek help from their own companions or attempt to track down the perpetrators themselves. The religious obligations that governed every aspect of the games would be incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. The constant sacrifices, prayers, and ceremonial requirements would consume enormous amounts of time and resources while serving no practical purpose from a contemporary perspective. However, failing to participate appropriately in religious observances would mark you as impious and potentially dangerous, making you a target for violence from religious zealots. The political tensions that simmered beneath the surface of Olympic competition would be dangerous for anyone who didn't understand the complex relationships between different Greek city-states. Innocent comments or gestures could be interpreted as political statements, and supporting the wrong athlete could identify you with enemies of powerful city-states. The Olympic truce was supposed to prevent violence during the Games, but it didn't eliminate political rivalries or personal grudges. The sexual dynamics of the ancient Olympics would be particularly problematic for modern visitors. The exclusion of women from the Games was absolute and violently enforced, but the presence of thousands of young male athletes who competed naked created an atmosphere of homoeroticism that was celebrated in ancient Greek culture, but would be confusing or threatening to people with modern sexual attitudes. The relationships between older men and younger athletes were governed by complex social rules that would be impossible for outsiders to navigate safely. The concepts of privacy and personal space that modern people take for granted simply didn't exist in ancient Greek society. The athletic events were conducted in full view of thousands of spectators. The living arrangements involved sharing space with strangers, and the bathing and grooming facilities were communal. Anyone who was uncomfortable with constant public exposure would find the Olympic experience unbearable. The pace of life in ancient Greece would be simultaneously too slow and too fast for modern sensibilities. Many activities that we accomplish quickly with modern technology would take enormous amounts of time and effort in the ancient world. However, the demands of survival and the intensity of social interactions would create constant pressure and stress that would be exhausting for people accustomed to more predictable and controlled environments. The legal system's emphasis on personal honor and family reputation would create obligations and expectations that modern people would find oppressive. Your behavior at the Olympics would reflect not just on yourself, but on your family, your city, and anyone who had supported your participation. The social consequences of failure or disgrace would extend far beyond your own life and could affect future generations of your descendants. The economic implications of Olympic participation would be devastating for anyone without substantial inherited wealth. The ancient Greek economy was based on agriculture, slavery, and small-scale crafts rather than the complex financial systems that support modern athletic careers. There were no sponsorship opportunities, no prize money, and no professional leagues that could provide income for successful athletes. Even Olympic victors typically returned home to resume their normal occupations, with their athletic achievements serving mainly as social status rather than economic advancement. The educational requirements for understanding ancient Greek culture would be enormous. The language itself was complex and highly inflected, with different dialects spoken in different regions and specialized vocabularies for religious, athletic, and political contexts. The literary and mythological knowledge that educated Greeks took for granted would require years of study to acquire, and without this background, most cultural references and social cues would be incomprehensible. The philosophical and intellectual framework that shaped ancient Greek thinking would be as foreign as the physical conditions of their lives. Their understanding of causation, justice, human nature, and the proper relationship between individuals and society was based on assumptions that modern people would find primitive or offensive. Their acceptance of slavery, exclusion of women from public life, and glorification of warfare as normal aspects of human existence reflected worldviews that are fundamentally incompatible with contemporary values. The medical and scientific knowledge available in ancient Greece would be inadequate for treating even minor injuries or illnesses that modern medicine handles routinely. The combination of primitive surgical techniques, lack of anesthesia, absence of antibiotics, and reliance on supernatural explanations for disease would make any medical emergency potentially fatal. The life expectancy for ancient Greeks was much lower than modern standards, and the quality of life for people with chronic conditions or disabilities was generally poor. The transportation systems that connected different parts of the ancient Greek world were unreliable and dangerous. Ships were small, poorly constructed, and subject to weather conditions that could delay journeys for weeks or sink vessels entirely. Overland travel was slow and exposed travelers to bandits, wild animals, and political conflicts. There were no maps, navigation instruments, or communication systems that could provide accurate information about routes, conditions, or destinations. The preservation and preparation of food in ancient Greece was based on techniques that would be considered unsafe by modern standards. There was no refrigeration, no understanding of bacterial contamination, and no quality control systems for ensuring that food was safe to eat. The combination of summer heat, large crowds, and primitive food handling would create ideal conditions for food poisoning and other digestive illnesses. The social hierarchies that governed ancient Greek society were rigid and violently enforced. Your status would be determined by your birth, your city of origin, your family's reputation, and your personal achievements in ways that would seem arbitrary and unfair to modern sensibilities. There was no concept of social mobility based on merit alone, and challenging the existing power structures was considered both dangerous and impious. The time commitment required for serious Olympic training would be incompatible with any other form of productive work or social responsibility. Ancient Greek athletes typically began training as children and continued until age or injury forced them to retire, dedicating their entire lives to athletic achievement. This level of specialization was possible only for people with independent wealth or wealthy patrons willing to support them indefinitely. The psychological pressure of representing your city, state in Olympic competition would be enormous. Ancient Greeks took civic pride seriously, and athletic defeats were interpreted as signs of divine disfavor that could affect the entire community. Athletes who failed to meet expectations would face not just personal disappointment, but social ostracism and political consequences that could affect their families and descendants. The environmental conditions in ancient Olympia would be harsh by any standard. The site was chosen for its religious significance rather than its practical advantages, and it lacked many of the natural features that would make it suitable for hosting large gatherings. The water supply was adequate for the local population, but insufficient for thousands of visitors. The terrain was difficult to navigate, and the climate was extreme during the summer months when the games were held. Your modern assumptions about gender roles, sexual behavior, and family relationships would be constantly challenged by ancient Greek practices and attitudes. The exclusion of women from athletic competition was just one aspect of a broader social system that assigned very different roles and expectations to men and women than contemporary society considers appropriate. The acceptance of homosexual relationships between older men and younger athletes was governed by complex social rules that would be difficult for modern people to understand or navigate. The religious beliefs that permeated every aspect of ancient Greek life would be impossible for a modern person to adopt authentically. The polytheistic system, with its emphasis on ritual observance, divine intervention in human affairs, and the constant possibility of supernatural punishment required a worldview that is fundamentally incompatible with contemporary scientific and rational thinking. However, failing to demonstrate appropriate religious devotion would mark you as dangerous and potentially subversive. The artistic and cultural knowledge that educated ancient Greeks possessed would take years to acquire and would be essential for understanding the social context of Olympic competition. The poems, songs, stories, and artistic traditions that provided the background for athletic events were deeply embedded in Greek culture and would be incomprehensible without extensive study. Your inability to appreciate or participate in these cultural expressions would mark you as uneducated and socially inferior. The physical conditioning required for ancient Olympic competition would be impossible to achieve with modern training methods and lifestyle habits. Ancient Greek athletes developed their strength, endurance, and pain tolerance through years of harsh training and daily physical labor that modern people would find unbearable. The combination of specialized exercises, extreme diet, and constant physical stress created bodies that were adapted to levels of exertion and punishment that would seriously injure contemporary athletes. In the final analysis, your chances of surviving the first Olympic Games would depend not just on avoiding the obvious physical dangers, but on successfully navigating a complex web of social, political, religious, and cultural expectations that would be completely foreign to modern experience. The ancient Greeks created a remarkable civilization that produced extraordinary achievements in athletics, arts, philosophy, and politics. But they did so within a framework of values and practices that modern people would find oppressive, dangerous, and morally objectionable. The romantic appeal of the ancient Olympics dissolves when confronted with the reality of what participation would actually require. The Games were not a celebration of universal human values, but a specific cultural institution that served the needs and reflected the beliefs of a particular society at a particular time in history. Understanding them requires historical empathy and intellectual humility rather than nostalgic fantasy or cultural imperialism. Your inability to survive the ancient Olympics would not be a personal failure, but a natural consequence of being adapted to different circumstances and challenges. The gap between ancient and modern life is not just technological but fundamental, involving basic assumptions about human nature, social organization, and the proper goals of human existence. The ancient Greeks solved the problems of their time and place in ways that worked for them. But their solutions would not work for us, just as our solutions would not work for them. The lesson of the ancient Olympics is not that we should try to recapture some lost golden age of athletic purity or spiritual significance. It is that human societies create institutions that serve their own needs and values, and those institutions must evolve or disappear as circumstances change. The survival and success of the modern Olympic movement demonstrates not the eternal appeal of ancient Greek ideals, but the human capacity to adapt old traditions to new conditions and requirements. Your hypothetical death at the first Olympics would be quick, probably painful, and entirely preventable by the standards of any civilization that had developed basic concepts of safety, fairness, and human rights. But it would also be meaningful within the context of ancient Greek culture, which valued honor, glory, and divine favor over individual survival and comfort. The ancient Greeks created something remarkable within the constraints of their own world, and we can appreciate their achievement without wanting to recreate their world or live according to their rules.